Today you're going to hear the story of one of the most disturbing women in Victorian Britain, Amelia Dyer. Some estimates and later reports have claimed she may have been responsible for the deaths of more than 400 babies and children, a number so extreme it sounds unreal. How much of that can be proven, how the system allowed anything like it to happen, and how she finally got caught, this video breaks it down from beginning to end. Amelia Dyer wasn't a gangster with a gun. She didn't need masks, robberies, or getaways. Her weapon was trust. She operated in a hidden market known as baby farming, a business that promised desperate mothers a safe home for their newborns, adoption arrangements, and confidentiality. In reality, it often meant neglect, deception, and death. And for years, she moved through that world with frightening ease, protected by social shame, weak laws, and the fact that the people most likely to speak up had the most to lose. Amelia was born Amelia Hobley in 1837 in a small village called Pile Marsh, east of Bristol, an area now absorbed into Bristol itself. Unlike many criminals of her era, she was not raised in extreme poverty. She was the youngest of 5 children, born into the household of Samuel Hobley, a reasonably well-off shoemaker, and Sarah Hobley, whose later illness would shape the entire family. Amelia learned to read and write, and as a child she loved literature and poetry, details that matter, because they show she was capable, articulate, and able to present herself well. But her childhood carried a darker weight. Her mother suffered serious mental decline after illness, and Amelia grew up witnessing episodes of instability that frightened the household. She also had to care for her mother until her mother died in 1848. That experience left Amelia unusually familiar with suffering, with the way families hide private crises, and with how illness can become an explanation that stops questions. Later, people would argue these events affected her psychologically. Whether they created damage, numbness, or something else entirely, they were part of the foundation. After her mother's death, Amelia lived for a time with an aunt in Bristol, then was apprenticed to a corset maker. In 1859, her father died, and her older brother inherited the family trade. By 1861, Amelia was living independently in Bristol, on Trinity Street. That independence was significant for a woman of the era, and it suggests she was not drifting through life, but moving forward on her own terms. That same year, she married George Thomas, a man far older than she was. He was 59, she was 24. Both lied about their ages at the marriage ceremony, likely to reduce the obvious scandal of the age gap. The marriage gave her something powerful in Victorian society: the protective cover of being Mrs. Thomas, a respectable married woman. In the years after marrying, Amelia trained as a nurse. Nursing in the Victorian era was exhausting, but it was also respected, and it gave her skills that would later become dangerous. She learned how to handle infants. She learned how to speak with medical authority. She learned the language of care, the language people trust. And she learned how easily death could be explained away in an era when infant mortality was frighteningly common. Through professional connections, including a relationship with a midwife named Ellen Dane, Amelia discovered a world where secrecy and desperation could be turned into money. Young, unmarried pregnant women needed discreet places to give birth. They needed shelter. They needed someone who would not expose them. Many were terrified of disgrace, poverty, and rejection. And after the birth, many had no safe way to keep a child while also working and surviving. That demand created a market. Arrangements where a woman would take a baby to nurse, to raise, or to place for adoption in exchange for payment. This was the system known as baby farming. On paper, it could sound like informal fostering or adoption. In practice, it often existed with minimal oversight. Some baby farmers genuinely cared for children. But the system also attracted people who saw babies as a financial transaction. A mother might pay weekly, or she might hand over a one-time lump sum, especially if she wanted the situation hidden permanently. And here is the brutal incentive that corrupted everything. A child costs money to feed and house. If the payment is one time, then keeping the baby alive becomes an expense, not a profit. The wider society helped create the conditions for abuse. Unmarried mothers were shamed. Fathers could avoid responsibility. Poor women could be denied support. Authorities struggled to track children or enforce standards. Coroners often listed infant deaths with vague causes that demanded no deeper investigation. And because infant death was common, a pattern could hide inside statistics without immediate alarm. Within this world, Amelia learned how to present herself as exactly what desperate mothers needed: respectable, reassuring, trustworthy. She used advertisements. She used polite letters. She offered comfort. She promised a good home, future adoption, and motherly love. Many women wanted to believe her because the alternative was unbearable. For a time, Amelia stepped away, partly because she had her own daughter, Ellen Thomas, and partly because her household situation shifted. But in 1869, George Thomas died, and Amelia became a widow. She now needed steady income, and she also had the perfect cover. A respectable widow with nursing experience, operating in a private market that society quietly depended on. Over time, according to investigators and later evidence, Amelia moved from neglect to something more direct and deliberate. The accusation was simple and horrifying. She took babies for money, and many of those babies never lived long after being handed over. The exact number of victims can't be fully proven, and that's part of what makes the story so unsettling. Some figures are documented, others are suspected, and some estimates grew to extraordinary, including the claim of hundreds of victims, because of how long she operated, how often she moved, and how many mothers later reported that their children disappeared without answers. For years, she avoided full accountability. Part of this was because evidence was hard to gather. Mothers were afraid to report, afraid of shame, afraid of losing what little standing they had. Records were scattered. Police forces were local and disconnected. And Amelia understood that fragmentation. She moved house. She used new names. She reset her identity. She stayed one step ahead of suspicion. In 1879, she was finally caught, after a doctor who had been called repeatedly to her home to certify deaths suspected something was wrong. But even then, she was not convicted of murder. She was sentenced to only 6 months for neglect. 6 months. It was a punishment that many later saw as shockingly light and a sign of how poorly the system was equipped, or how unwilling it was, to treat infant deaths with the seriousness they deserved. After her release, Amelia returned to the same world. And she developed another method of protection. She began presenting herself as mentally unstable when it benefited her. She entered psychiatric hospitals more than once, sometimes voluntarily, claiming suicidal thoughts or breakdowns. The timing was suspicious. These episodes often appeared when pressure increased, when it was useful for her to disappear, or when she needed sympathy rather than scrutiny. And as a former nurse, Amelia knew exactly how to behave inside such institutions to secure a relatively tolerable existence. She also began using opiate-based preparations and alcohol, whether as genuine addiction, as a coping mechanism, or as an operational tool. Her mental instability may have been real, exaggerated, or strategically performed. But either way, it helped her blur responsibility in the eyes of others. By the early 1890s, Amelia had learned from earlier mistakes. Calling doctors too often created witnesses and paperwork. So she reduced contact with medical authorities. She became more mobile. She became more secretive. She used multiple aliases. She moved through different towns, leaving behind mothers with unanswered letters and children who were never returned. In 1893, she was discharged from what would be her last stay in a Welsh asylum, and unlike earlier periods, she was not accepted back again. 2 years later, she relocated to Caversham, Berkshire, bringing with her an older assistant known as Granny Jane Smith, recruited from a workhouse, and her daughter Mary and, known as Polly, along with Polly's husband Arthur Palmer. Amelia convinced Jane Smith to pose as her mother in front of clients. It was a calculated image. 2 older women, mother and daughter, presenting a stable, domestic home. Exactly what frightened young mothers wanted to see. This is Amelia Dyer near the end of her long run. Experienced, practiced, more careful, and protected by the same social shame that kept mother silent. And then, in early 1896, a young woman placed an advertisement looking for a respectable caretaker for her baby. Amelia answered under yet another name, writing words that sounded gentle, warm, and safe. Those words would trigger the chain of events that finally brought the police to her door. That's where the next part begins. By the time Amelia Dyer entered the mid-1890s, she wasn't simply a woman committing crimes in secret. She had become a system inside a system, someone who understood exactly where Victorian society was weak, where shame silenced people, where paperwork failed, where authority looked the other way, and where a convincing performance could replace proof. The tragedy is that none of this required genius. It required patience, confidence, and a willingness to treat human lives as disposable. Baby farming existed because respectable society demanded it exist. That's a hard truth, but it matters. The same culture that condemned unmarried mothers created the conditions where those mothers had to disappear, hide, and negotiate in the shadows. The same moral pressure that called a woman ruined for pregnancy outside marriage also created the market that predators could exploit. Amelia Dyer didn't invent the market. She stepped into it and weaponized it. And as she did, she learned 3 rules. First, when people feel shame, they become quiet. Second, when oversight is weak, you can move and start again. Third, when death is common, death is easy to hide. That last point is especially important. Infant mortality in the 19th century was tragically high, and in many places it was perceived as almost normal for babies to die. That does not mean it wasn't mourned. It means that the public and the law often accepted vague explanations without digging deeper. A baby could be listed as dying from weakness, wasting, failure to thrive, convulsions, or simple starvation, and those words could end the conversation. In a world without modern forensic systems and with inconsistent medical reporting, a caregiver could rely on ambiguity as a shield. Now combine that with the economics of baby farming. A mother might pay weekly for care, but weekly payments meant responsibility, because if the baby died too quickly, the mother might demand answers. A single lump sum was more dangerous for the child, because once the money was received, the caregiver's financial incentive to keep the baby alive disappeared. Feeding, clothing, medicine, those were expenses. And a baby, in purely financial terms, became a liability. This is why many baby farmers, especially the fraudulent ones, preferred a lump sum. It made the entire service fast, clean, and final. Amelia understood how to sell that arrangement. She wrote letters that sounded warm and maternal. She used language that mothers wanted to believe. Good home, proper comfort, loving care, like my own. She also understood how to use identity as persuasion. Sometimes she presented herself as a married woman. Sometimes as a widow. Sometimes she brought another older woman to play mother, to give the impression of a stable household with 2 generations of caretakers. It was theatre, but it was effective theatre, because her clients were desperate, and desperation lowers the threshold for trust. And there is something else Amelia understood. Most of these women could not safely fight back. If a mother accused a baby farmer of wrongdoing, she risked exposing her own shame. She risked losing a job, losing a place to live, losing family support. In Victorian England, that fear was not theoretical. It was practical and brutal. So Amelia could ignore letters. She could delay replies. She could write soothing notes that bought time. She could move addresses. She could change names. She could claim the baby had been adopted. She could claim the baby was ill. She could say the baby died quietly. And she could do all this while the mother had almost no power to challenge her. 4 years the pattern continued, and even when Amelia was flagged by authorities once, most notably in 1879, the consequences were limited. A short sentence for neglect did not destroy her ability to continue. If anything, it forced her to refine her methods. After that period, reports describe her moving frequently and operating under multiple aliases. She became harder to track. And as suspicion increased, she developed another strategy that blurred accountability. She began presenting episodes of mental instability at moments when it benefited her to vanish or reset. She had spent time around institutions as a nurse. She knew what doctors expected to see in a troubled patient. She knew what behavior would be interpreted as distress. And she knew that madness could turn moral outrage into pity, or at least hesitation. In a society that often treated women's mental health through the lens of stereotypes, that role could protect her. But by the early 1890s, she appeared to be entering a more dangerous phase. More mobile, less reliant on doctors, and more willing to eliminate risks. She also began surrounding herself with a structure. In 1895, she moved to Caversham, in Berkshire, along with an older assistant, Jane Smith, known as Granny, and her daughter Mary and, known as Polly, and Polly's husband Arthur Palmer. This setup mattered. A household with multiple adults could receive visitors without raising eyebrows. It could explain baby cries. It could manage deliveries and errands. It could pass as normal domestic life. And to clients, it looked reassuring. In Not Alone, We Are Respectable Women, We Have a Proper Home. Amelia even convinced Jane Smith to present herself as Amelia's mother. That detail tells you how carefully the performance was constructed. She wasn't merely hiding a crime, she was selling an image. Then, in early 1896, a name appears that becomes the turning point. Evelyn Marmon. Evelyn Marmon was a 25-year-old barmaid. She had given birth outside marriage, a situation that placed her in an extremely vulnerable position. Like many women in similar circumstances, she needed to return to work. She hoped she could find temporary care for her baby and eventually bring her child back. She placed an advertisement in a newspaper. The wording is heartbreaking in its simplicity. She wanted a respectable woman to take a little child. That word, respectable, was not a preference. It was survival. Respectable meant discreet. Respectable meant safe. Respectable meant not cruel. Respectable meant the child wouldn't be harmed. Near Evelyn's advertisement was another one, the kind of ad that, to a desperate mother, could look like a miracle. A couple, supposedly childless, offering to take in a healthy child, promising a good home, asking for a set payment. Evelyn responded to the advertiser, a Mrs. Harding. Within days, she received a letter. It was from Amelia Dyer. The letter, written in a warm, domestic voice, insisted that Mrs. Harding would love to have a dear little girl, to raise her and call her her own. It described a respectable home, simple people, comfortable conditions. It emphasized that the child would not be taken for money, but for companionship and love. It promised what Evelyn most needed, that her baby would have a mother's care. But the money issue mattered. Evelyn wanted to pay weekly, because that was more affordable and because it allowed continued connection. Ongoing payment implies ongoing accountability. Amelia, under the Mrs. Harding identity, insisted on a lump sum. That demand is a red flag in hindsight. But in the moment, with social pressure and practical panic, Evelyn agreed. She paid £10, an amount that could represent months of wages for a working woman, and provided a box of clothing for the baby. A week later, Mrs. Harding arrived to collect the child. Evelyn was reportedly surprised by the woman's age and rough appearance. Amelia did not look like the fairy tale rescuer described in the letter. But Amelia was skilled at acting. She was affectionate toward the baby. She spoke calmly. She performed competence. Evelyn, emotionally torn and desperate, handed over her daughter, Doris Marmon, along with the clothes and the money. She accompanied Amelia by train for part of the journey, first to Cheltenham Station and onward, then returned home devastated, described as a broken woman. For Evelyn Marmon, the act of handing over her baby was not abandonment. It was a gamble. It was an attempt to survive and return later. She expected updates. She expected to write letters. She expected a path back. A few days later, she received a note from Mrs. Harding saying everything was fine. Evelyn wrote back. She never received another reply. What happened next, according to evidence presented later, was the moment Amelia finally pushed too far, too carelessly, or perhaps simply met the limits of her own control. Instead of travelling to her supposed home in Reading as she had told Evelyn, Amelia went to a house on Mayo Road in Willesden, London, where her daughter Polly lived. There, Doris Marmon became one of her final victims. The precise details of the child's death are deeply disturbing, and it's not necessary to sensationalize them. What matters, and what investigators later focused on, is the method. A white tape or edging ribbon used around the child's neck. It was not an accident, not neglect, but deliberate killing. And when Amelia later spoke to police, she described this ribbon as something that was part of her, almost like a signature. That language is chilling, because it suggests routine. It suggests repetition. It suggests that what should be unthinkable had become normal to her. After Doris was killed, evidence indicated that the child's body was wrapped, some accounts say with cloth and items of the baby's clothing. The remaining clothes were treated as property. Things to pawn, to sell, to turn into cash. That kind of detail pulls the crime out of the abstract. It shows the economic logic at work. The baby was paid for, the baby was removed, the clothing became resale, the mother's money became profit. And then Amelia continued. The next day, another child arrived. Harry Simmons, around 13 months old. The pattern repeated. The same ribbon used on Doris was reportedly reused. Again, the key point is not graphic detail. The key point is that it was a method and a rhythm, almost like an assembly line of death. 2 bodies. 1 bag. Bricks for weight. On April 2, 1896, Amelia travelled toward an area she knew well, near Caversham Lock, close to Reading. She disposed of the bag in the River Thames, assuming the water would swallow evidence the way it had swallowed so many secrets before. But Amelia had miscalculated something crucial. Water does not always hide. Sometimes it returns. And the Thames had already begun returning bodies. Unknown to Amelia, just days earlier, on March 30, 1896, a bargeman found a parcel in the Thames near Reading. Inside was the body of a child later identified as Helen Fry. The discovery triggered attention, but it needed a connection. Bodies alone can become anonymous tragedies unless someone finds an address, a label, a scrap of paper that leads somewhere. That is where the detective work becomes important, because it shows how Amelia's world of secrecy finally began to collapse. A detective constable named Anderson, working with the Reading police under Superintendent George Tousley, examined evidence connected to the parcel. And in the wrapping or labeling, he found traces, details that could be followed. A name began to emerge. An address. A faint thread. Investigators began to suspect that the person behind the parcels in the river was connected to baby farming. That suspicion grew when witnesses in Bristol, police contacts, and other reports suggested a woman using various names, one of the Mrs. Thomas, had taken multiple children recently. Police calculated that in the months before her arrest, at least 20 children had been handed to this woman under that identity alone. 20 in just a short period. Now imagine the scale when extended over years and decades. This is where the infamous estimates enter the story. Claims that Amelia could have killed hundreds, possibly more than 400. That number was never fully proven in court, but the reason it persists is obvious. She operated over a very long time, she used multiple aliases, she moved constantly, and the children she took were often the children of women who feared speaking out. In other words, the true number may never be known. What police did know, finally, was that this had become urgent. They began surveillance on Amelia's home. They believed she might flee if she sensed attention. They even used a young woman as bait, an undercover approach to arrange contact and confirm that the baby farming operation was active. Amelia was expecting a client. Instead, she opened her door to detectives. On April 3rd, Good Friday, police raided the house. They did not find bodies inside, but they found the wreckage of a system. White edging tape, telegrams arranging baby transfers, pawn tickets for children's clothes, advertisement receipts, letters from mothers asking about their babies, and paperwork that suggested a network of transactions, babies moving in, money moving in, and then silence. That's what finally changed the case from rumor to proof. The home did not need to contain a corpse to contain guilt. It contained the evidence of a business built on false promises. It contained the paper trail of broken mothers. And it contained the tools of the method. Amelia was arrested on April 4th, 1896, and charged with murder. Her son-in-law Arthur Palmer was also accused as an accessory, and the investigation widened. Police dragged the Thames. They searched for what Amelia had thrown away. And the river began to yield more evidence, more small bodies, each one turning private grief into public fact. Among the recovered victims were Doris Marmon and Harry Simmons. And once Doris was identified, the human cost of Amelia's system became visible in a single mother's face. Evelyn Marmon, only 11 days after handing over her baby, was brought to the horrible task of confirming what had happened. The correspondence in Amelia's possession, the clothing, the evidence, pieces of a life turned into proof of death. From that point on, Amelia could not hide behind silence or movement. She could not disappear into a new town. She could not claim confusion or misunderstanding. The river, the letters, the tape, the pawn tickets, and the witnesses were forming one story. And now the case was no longer about social shame. It was about murder. In the next part, the investigation becomes a courtroom drama. Old Bailey, the attempt to frame her as insane, the speed of the verdict, and the final weeks where she wrote pages and pages of her confession, insisting that others should not be blamed for her crimes. And at the end of it all, Amelia Dyer would stand where Victorian justice always ended for killers. Beneath the drop. Once Amelia Dyer was in custody, the case stopped being rumour and became machinery. The kind of machinery Victorian society relied on when it wanted to prove a point. Police procedure, coroners, witnesses, courtrooms, newspapers, and the slow grind of turning scattered horrors into a single charge that could stand in a court of law. But even with all the shock surrounding her arrest, investigators faced a brutal truth. They were likely looking at only a fraction of what had happened. Amelia Dyer had operated for decades. She moved often. She used multiple identities. She advertised under different names. She accepted babies from women who were afraid to be seen, afraid to write their own addresses on letters, afraid to report the disappearance of their children to police. This meant the evidence wasn't clean. It wasn't centralized. It wasn't neatly documented. It was emotional, fragmented, and hidden in drawers and memory, until the Thames began giving bodies back. The discovery of bodies in the river changed everything. Rivers don't negotiate. They don't accept excuses. They don't care how respectable someone sounds in a letter. A body in water becomes a question that must be answered, and once the police began to suspect a pattern, they had a direction. Baby farming linked to disappearance, disappearance linked to death, death linked to disposal. When officers raided Amelia's home, they reportedly encountered a smell that suggested decomposition, yet no human remains were found inside. That wasn't proof of innocence. It was proof of method. Amelia had evolved. If bodies were dangerous in the home, then bodies had to be removed. If doctors were dangerous because they created paperwork, then doctors had to be avoided. If neighbors were dangerous because they could notice patterns, then she had to move often. Every part of the raid pointed to someone who had learned from mistakes and refined her process. And the paperwork was damning. Letters from mothers. Telegrams arranging transfers. Receipts for advertisements. Pawn tickets for children's clothing. It wasn't one transaction, it was many. It wasn't a moment, it was a system. Police estimated that in just the months leading up to her arrest, at least 20 children had been handed over to a woman using one of Amelia's identities, Mrs. Thomas. Even without pushing into decades, that number alone was enough to terrify investigators. 20 children, and the question immediately became, where are they? Now the case expanded beyond one victim. It became an attempt to map an invisible graveyard, one made of missing names, unreturned letters, and mothers who suddenly realized hope had been a lie. The authorities began searching the Thames more intensively. And as more bodies were recovered, a horrifying consistency linked them. It wasn't just that children were found. It was how they were found, wrapped, weighted, and disposed of in ways that suggested planning rather than panic. And there was a repeated element that investigators recognized as signature-like: the use of white tape or ribbon. This mattered because it collapsed the defense of accident and neglect. Neglect can kill, yes, but the repeated presence of a specific method tied deaths together. It suggested intention across multiple incidents. It suggested that what happened to one child wasn't a tragedy, it was a pattern. As the investigation widened, people around Amelia were pulled into the storm. Her daughter, Polly. Her son-in-law, Arthur Palmer. Her assistant, Jane Smith. The public wanted a conspiracy, because people often find it hard to accept that such behavior can exist in one person alone over so many years. Investigators had to determine whether Amelia had help, or whether her household was simply collateral. Family members living close to the crimes without understanding their scale or nature. Arthur Palmer in particular faced suspicion. In cases involving disposal and repeated movement, it's easy to assume multiple hands. But the evidence against him and others proved weak. And here we see another side of Amelia's personality. Even when facing death, she wanted to control the narrative. From prison, Amelia wrote a statement insisting that her daughter and son-in-law were not involved. She declared, in essence, that she alone was responsible, and that she did not want innocent people dragged down with her. The wording was filled with religious language, talk of God as judge and of answering to her Creator. Some would interpret this as repentance. Others would interpret it as strategy. A final attempt to manage consequences, protect family, and limit the number of prosecutions. Either way, the statement had legal effect. The case against Arthur Palmer collapsed, and he was released. But Amelia was not released. And she was not treated as a tragic figure. The mood of the time was rage. The late Victorian press fed on stories like this. Crime sold newspapers, and child death stirred the deepest public emotion. The idea that babies, symbols of innocence, had been traded like goods triggered a kind of moral panic. People demanded harsh punishment. Politicians and reformers demanded regulation. And in Amelia Dyer, the public found a face for everything they feared about hidden vice and exploitation. Yet even amid the outrage, the legal system still had to do something very specific. Pick a case that could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. In an era before modern forensic certainty, prosecutors could not risk trying to prove dozens or hundreds of murders. They needed one solid charge, tied to evidence, witnesses, and identification. They needed a victim whose mother could testify. They needed the chain of events back to Amelia. In the end, they built the case around one murder: Doris Marman. The Doris Marman case had what prosecutors needed. The mother, Evelyn Marman, could testify about the handover. The advertisement, the letter, the payment, the transfer of the baby, the promised care, the lack of replies. Police evidence placed Amelia's movements in the correct time frame. And the bodies recovered from the Thames gave physical confirmation that the child did not simply go to a good home. The child died. This is where the investigation became a courtroom narrative with a beginning and an end. Because the public wanted to hear not only that Amelia was guilty, but how she had done it, and why she had been allowed to do it for so long. On May 22, 1896, Amelia Dyer appeared at the Old Bailey. She pleaded guilty to the murder of Doris Marman. That plea matters. Not only because it admitted her responsibility in one case, but because it removed the need for a full trial on that specific charge. It also created a strange tension. The public wanted every detail, yet the legal process moved quickly. The system had proof and a confession. Now the question was sentencing, and whether any defense could stop the rope. The only realistic defense for Amelia was insanity. It wasn't an invented idea from nowhere. Amelia had a history of claiming mental instability. She had previously entered asylums. She had attempted self-harm. Her mother had suffered mental illness. If the defense could persuade the court she was not responsible for her actions, she could avoid execution. But the prosecution went after that defense hard. They argued that Amelia's breakdowns were convenient, that they appeared when suspicion rose, that they functioned as a shield rather than as true incapacity. They argued that her ability to conduct business, write persuasive letters, arrange meetings, move cities, use aliases, manage payments, pawn clothing, and organize disposal showed planning incompatible with being legally insane in the way the law required. In other words, even if Amelia had mental instability, the prosecution insisted she knew what she was doing, and she knew it was wrong, and she tried to avoid consequences. That, in the court's eyes, was sanity. Witnesses describe how easily she reassured women, how she insisted on single payments, how she performed affection once and then disappeared. The evidence from the raid, letters and pawn tickets, reinforced the picture of an organized pattern rather than a chaotic break from reality. And then the jury decided. They took only minutes, reported as about 4.5, to return a guilty verdict that carried the death sentence. That speed tells you what the jury felt: certainty, anger, and perhaps relief at the chance to close the case in a way that felt decisive. Society demanded a clear punishment, and the law delivered it. Amelia Dyer was sentenced to death. From that moment, Victorian law considered her dead in the eyes of the law, even though she still breathed. Symbolically, she was already gone. What remained was time in a condemned cell, time for final visits, time for prayer, time for writing, and time for whatever form of explanation she could offer. During her weeks awaiting execution, Amelia wrote obsessively. She filled multiple notebooks, 5, according to reports, with what she called her confession, her final account. Whether those pages were true, complete, or crafted to shape history is another question. But the act itself reveals something. Even facing death, she wanted to speak last. She wanted to define what the world would remember. A chaplain visited her. He asked if she had anything to confess. Amelia reportedly handed him her writings and asked, in effect, whether that wasn't enough. It's a chilling moment because it suggests a person who still viewed confession as transaction. Words in exchange for spiritual relief, notebooks in exchange for closure. There was also a strange legal twist while she awaited death. Authorities intended to call her as a witness in proceedings involving her daughter Polly, an attempt to determine if Polly had any involvement. But those proceedings were scheduled after Amelia's execution date. The court ruled that because Amelia had been sentenced, she would be legally dead. Her testimony would not be admissible in the future. In a dark irony, her legal death arrived before her physical one, and the system refused to delay her execution for the sake of future questions. Just before her execution, she learned that charges against Polly were dropped. Again, interpretation splits. Did Amelia truly shield her daughter, or did investigators simply lack evidence? Either way, Amelia ensured that the public story would end with her as the central villain rather than a family conspiracy. And then the final day came. On Wednesday, June 10, 1896, Amelia Dyer was executed at Newgate Prison. The hangman was James Billington, one of the most well-known executioners of the period. The hour was morning. The process was routine by the standards of the time, cold, procedural, designed to be final. When asked at the scaffold if she had anything to say, Amelia answered simply. She had nothing to say. After all the letters, all the performance, all the notebooks, the story ended not with an explanation, but with silence. But her death did not end the outrage. In some ways, it intensified it. Because once the public had a name and a face, they wanted answers to the wider question. How could a woman operate in plain sight for so long? How could dozens of mothers hand over children and receive nothing but empty letters and excuses? How could authorities miss patterns? How could doctors certify deaths without alarms? How could advertisements be placed so easily? How could the market exist at all? Amelia's case became fuel for reform conversations. Not just about one killer, but about the hidden economy of desperation. It became a warning about unregulated adoption and fostering arrangements. It became a symbol of what happens when society punishes motherhood outside marriage so severely that it drives women into the shadows, where predators wait. And then came the final haunting element. The number. Even after conviction, even after execution, the full scale remained uncertain. Some estimates grew huge, hundreds, even more than 400. Those numbers were based on patterns, on the length of her career, on the missing children in her records, and on the fact that only a limited number of victims could ever be formally identified. The true number may never be known. Which means Amelia Dyer's legacy is not just in what was proven, but in what was left unanswered. Because the most terrifying thing about her story is not that the law caught her in 1896. It's the possibility that for decades before that, she wasn't caught because the world wasn't looking. That is where our final block begins. The aftermath, the historical impact, the debate around victim totals, and how Amelia Dyer became a permanent symbol of Victorian horror, less a single criminal, and more a mirror held up to a society that created the perfect conditions for her to exist. After Amelia Dyer was executed, Victorian England got what it thought it wanted. A clear ending, a public punishment, and a single name that could carry the weight of an entire nightmare. The press called her a monster. The public treated her like a warning carved into history. And the legal system, having completed its work, moved on to the next case. But the truth is, the real story did not end when the trapdoor opened at Newgate. Because Amelia Dyer was not just an individual criminal. She was the product of a space society had allowed to exist, an underground economy built from desperation, shame, and the lack of meaningful oversight. If you remove Dyer from the picture completely, the mechanism that made her possible still remains. Unmarried mothers still feared exposure, poor women still faced brutal choices, babies were still surrendered through informal arrangements, and records were still fragile. Dyer became infamous because she was a concentrated expression of what that system could become when a predator learned to operate inside it. That is why the aftermath of her case matters. It forces a question that true crime should always ask. Not only what did the criminal do, but what conditions allowed it to continue. In the weeks after her death, stories intensified. Newspapers repeated details. Pamphlets circulated. People spoke her name as if it carried infection. And almost immediately, the number attached to her began to expand beyond anything proven in court. Dozens of children were suspected, and some accounts and later reports claim hundreds, often repeating the idea that she might have been responsible for more than 400 deaths. This is where the line between documentation and estimation becomes important. What was proven conclusively? A specific murder charge, Doris Marman, and the associated evidence and confession. Additional bodies recovered from the Thames strengthened the argument that her crimes were not isolated. Police records suggested many children had passed into her care in a relatively short period under certain names. Pawn tickets, letters, and advertisements indicated repeated transactions. Taken together, it supported the conclusion that more than one child had died because of her. But could anyone prove 400 individual murders? Not in a Victorian court. not with the record-keeping available, not with mothers too afraid to come forward, not with children transferred under multiple identities across different addresses and counties, and not when the legal strategy of murder prosecution demanded one airtight case rather than dozens of weaker ones. So the number became part fact, part fear, part inference. And that is exactly why it has lasted. Because Amelia Dyer's victims belong to a category of people the era struggled to protect. Infants without paperwork, mothers without power. Some babies would have been registered late or not at all. Some mothers used fake names. Some arrangements were made through intermediaries. Some women moved and married and never spoke of the child again. Some were too poor to travel to another town to ask questions. Some were too frightened of being judged to step into a police station and admit the story. What Amelia exploited wasn't only legal weakness. It was emotional isolation. She understood that in most cases, the mother would be alone with her grief and fear. She understood that silence was part of the transaction. And that meant that even after her execution, the true list of names could never be fully reconstructed. This is how a criminal becomes a legend, not because the crimes are exaggerated for drama, but because the world cannot confidently measure the full damage. Wherever numbers are uncertain, horror expands to fill the space. And yet, one of the most chilling aspects of the Dyer case is that she did not rely on sophisticated deception. She relied on ordinary social habits. The assumption that a respectable woman is safe, the belief that a warm letter means good intention, the idea that a domestic home is harmless, the expectation that death, especially infant death, might simply be natural. In other words, she used society's comfort against itself. The baby farming world, as exposed by cases like hers, was not a single organized industry, it was a network of private arrangements, newspaper advertisements, and informal agreements that existed because official systems failed to provide humane alternatives. For mothers with no support, baby farmers were often presented as the only path that avoided the workhouse. That desperation created demand, and demand created predators. In the aftermath, the public demanded reforms. Authorities and medical voices increasingly treated baby farming not as a private moral issue but as a state concern. The arguments were blunt. If you allow people to take babies for money with little inspection, then neglect and abuse will flourish. If you permit loosely monitored adoption and fostering, then children can vanish without trace. If you shame mothers so aggressively that they hide pregnancies and hand over infants in secrecy, you create perfect conditions for exploitation. Amelia Dyer became the case used to justify that logic. But even reform has limits. You cannot legislate away human desperation. You can reduce risk with oversight. You can improve record keeping. You can regulate paid caretaking. But if society still punishes women socially and economically for pregnancy outside marriage, the shadows will always exist. And Dyer operated in those shadows. That's the deeper discomfort. She wasn't just a murderer hiding from the system. She was hiding inside the system's blind spots. Her crimes were not committed in one dramatic event with loud witnesses. They were committed quietly, repeatedly, and in places where people did not want to look. The psychological side is equally dark. People have asked for over a century what kind of person could do this. Some point to her childhood. Witnessing her mother's mental decline, caring for her, living in a home shaped by illness and fear. Some point to her nursing background. Familiarity with death and with the language used to explain it away. Some point to addiction. Opiate preparations and alcohol, potentially dulling empathy and increasing detachment. Some point to calculated greed. The simplest motive, repeated again and again. But perhaps the most accurate answer is the least dramatic. She became comfortable with it. That is what repetition does to a person who lacks restraint. A first crime is shocking even to the criminal. A 10th becomes practical. A 50th becomes routine. And by the time someone like Dyer is caught, what the public sees as unimaginable has already become, in the criminal's mind, an ordinary business process. That is why her own reported language about the ribbon, treating it almost like a personal hallmark, is so chilling. It suggests a person who turned murder into habit. And then there is the final, bitter irony. The case that brought her down did not begin as an investigation into her home. It began because a body surfaced in the river, because disposal failed. For decades, she survived the social system. What ended her was physical evidence the water refused to keep. The Thames became unwilling witness. And once police found the first parcel, the entire structure of her secrecy collapsed. One child, discovered by chance, triggered a chain reaction. Surveillance, raid, letters, pawn tickets, recovered bodies, testimony, confession, and execution. So what is Amelia Dyer's story, in the end? It is the story of a woman who built a life by promising motherhood while destroying it. It is the story of women cornered by shame into choices they hated. It is the story of an era where a baby could change hands with nothing but an advertisement and a handshake. It is the story of how a respectable cover, widow, nurse, caretaker, can disguise a predator. And it is also the story of how history remembers evil. Because Amelia Dyer didn't become infamous simply because she killed. She became infamous because her crimes were bound to the most vulnerable and because they revealed a horrifying truth. Sometimes the worst predators do not come from outside society, wearing obvious danger. Sometimes they live inside its normal routines, letters, payments, promises, until a single piece of evidence forces the world to see what it refused to see before. Even now, when people speak her name, they tend to focus on the number. How many victims, how many babies, how many years? But the real meaning of that number, whether it was dozens or hundreds, is not the statistic itself. It is what the statistic represents. Children who vanished without protection, mothers who carried grief in silence, and a society that made secrecy easier than safety. Amelia Dyer's ending was public. Her crimes were private. And in between those two realities sits the lesson that makes her story endure. When shame and poverty drive people into the shadows don't stay empty. They fill.